Cloud Thunder is a perfectly normal fortress. Or at least, it was. Until this guy took over. What is this guy? This is a gremlin. And not the type that you can't feed after midnight. But gremlins in the video game Dwarf Fortress have a stranger position in the game than maybe even the direct-to-video movies from our childhood. Gremlins are so baked into Dwarf Fortress's code that they can do things that most creatures cannot, including joining a fortress, and learning to speak, and then slowly taking over. This is the story of my little gremlin, and how I let him destroy my fortress. So let's wind back to the beginning, because that's where all stories begin. Fortress Cloud Thunder began the way most fortresses do, with 7 dwarves, precariously perched on the edge of this cliff, with water flowing below and a waterfall just up north. But there's one quirk. It's the year 1010. That means this world is very old. Most worlds in Dwarf Fortress range between 100 to 500 years old. This one's about twice as old as the norm. For those of you who are unfamiliar, Dwarf Fortress has a very active world generation, where it generates many moments of history. Often, certain evil forces end up taking over these worlds as they age, making the older the world, the more dangerous it tends to be. This particular world is quite odd, as many of the more supernatural forces, such as necromancy, never really caught on as fashionable in this world. However, that didn't stop the goblin supremacy. The humans were wiped out within the first 50 years, most of the dwarves have been obliterated, and only a few elves remain, most of them having sided with the goblins. And that's where Cloud Thunder comes in. My intent with this fortress was to build a stronghold that could be easily defended by my dwarves. I was hoping to be able to build some creative defenses, and fight some huge battles against an unstoppable, undefeatable enemy. And honestly, very quickly I got my wish. As the years passed and the fortress built up, and more dwarves moved in, the sieges became frequent, and the threats became great. But once the dwarves breached into the caverns, and began plucking around and exploring the depths, rustling in the distance was often heard. It was strange. So the dwarves set up traps to try and catch whatever creatures might be zipping about in the basements. But there are some creatures that are a little bit more tricky than that. And when the first gremlin was spotted, the dwarves knew that some more engineering was going to have to take place. Of course, the option was always there to simply kill the creature, but the dwarves had never encountered a gremlin before and could hear it muttering. Maybe it could speak. The only logical thing to do was to try their best to catch it. But because of how clever gremlins are, it wasn't going to be as simple as just making a cage trap. The gremlin would have to be startled and knocked into the trap, because they're acutely aware of their surroundings. Fortunately, gremlins have a major weakness, and this is levers. You see, gremlins have one purpose, and most dwarves find that purpose disgusting. They disobey orders and pull levers. That is all that they do. Regardless of who they know, what they like, and what they do, if they see a lever, they simply cannot resist the urge to give it a tug. And this is how we're going to catch this gremlin. In the background, I've been constructing a very specific type of trap, and this is something that the dwarves used to catch their future overlord. How does it work? Well, it's pretty simple. Gravity. The first step is placing the support. And the support structure is a small beam which is built out of a block, a log, a brick, or whatever material is available. Once it's constructed, it can be used like any kind of wall and have items built on top of it. However, pillars are unique in that levers can be connected to them, similar to drawbridges or doors. When a lever is connected to the pillar, if there's something constructed on top of it, and it's not supported by any walls surrounding it, that thing falls. This causes a bunch of dust to fly into the air, and anything nearby to be knocked backwards. In this case, I've placed the lever directly in front, with cage traps all the way around it, so that whenever some creature is silly enough to try pulling on that lever, there will suddenly be a very large cloud of dust directly in front of them. And this will, ideally, not crush them and instead send them flying backwards and into one of the cage traps. The better question is, will it work? Well, only time will tell. But regardless of the engineering marvels such as this gremlin catching apparatus, the dwarves were quite busy with things, mostly keeping the fortress afloat. The population was quite high, having risen to 176, and the more aware of you may notice that the fortress is now 10 years old, having started back in the old days of the year 1010. The first decade of the fortress's existence was quite the struggle between the sieges, were-creatures, thieves, kidnappers, and elven ambushes of all shapes and sizes. As far as the dwarves were concerned, the fact that the population was as high as it was and general morale was as good as it was nothing short of a marvel, especially when you take into consideration the strange mandates from fortress management, such as the military may only equip weapons of artifact quality, meaning most of the military was equipped with double shields. And while it might look silly, never underestimate the power of a wall of whackboards, such as those shields, and when a dwarf does have a weapon, you know that they've earned it. But such restrictions are strange in a place as dangerous as this, because Cloud Thunder is nestled between a small river and the ferocious rolling hills, right next to the untamed wilds. Here lurks giant bugs, elephants, giant rhinoceroses and hippos, amongst other horrific threats. And there have been many complaints to the fortress manager about how they wish that the place was safer. The dwarves wanted to seal the doors and completely forego sunlight in order to maintain safety. Management denied this and instead constructed a great gate, complete with a drowning pool, to completely consume any invading armies. While the system was quite efficient, it often caused collateral damage, and the death toll during construction was absolutely catastrophic. And the amount of work is so great that even children have to help transport construction materials. Thankfully, the fortress has a pretty robust minecart system for moving boulders up from the great depths and to the surface. All of the threats to the fortress's sovereignty aside, I haven't even mentioned the forgotten beasts. There have been dozens in the last decade, multiple per year. The monsters would lurch their way out of the darkness of the caverns, only to obliterate everything in their wake. But no matter, for a vile force of darkness has arrived. And they seem to have arrived at a very peculiar time, for at that exact moment, a group of goblin criminals had arrived, attempting to steal something from the fortress, no doubt. Since these criminals were unaffiliated with the goblins, who wanted to siege and take our glorious artifacts, goblins quickly dispatched of them. Unfortunately, this would break their parley, and we wouldn't even have an opportunity to discuss with them. Not like we had any real intention of it. Some of those thieves even made it into the fortress, and the dwarves quickly turned their foreheads into paste. Hammer time.
That is hammer time,
you could say. But of course that wouldn't stop the brilliant murderous green boys from attacking anyways. Even though they probably presumed that their attempt would be futile, they wandered towards the great entrance of Cloud Thunder, surprisingly swiftly at that. The dwarves sealed up the extra entrances and prepared for battle. An order was sent out to the soldiers to equip any recently created artifacts, and the army of demonically brainwashed green boys wander in the front door, accompanied by their fleshy bird things, known as beak dogs. And when a great enough number of them was inside, the order was given. It was time to open the machine, which would expel pressurized water into the area where the goblins now stood. This is an editor's note. I would like to inform everybody that do not worry. There is in fact water there. It's just kind of an artifact of how Dwarf Fortress works, making it so that when there is water on top of a drawbridge, the drawbridge sprite is prioritized over the water sprite, but I assure you that there is water there. This is an example where ASCII makes things clearer, so here is it in ASCII so that you can see that yes, there is in fact water there and they are drowning. On with the video. Once the goblins finish drowning, another lever is pulled, which dumps all of the liquid, goblins and all, down a very, very, very long garbage chute and into the caverns. Most sieges like this would take 2 to 3 reps of these lever pulls, and ideally the soldiers wouldn't even need to enter combat. Of course, there was always examples where this would fail, and the soldiers would have to enter combat anyway. Thankfully, the system generally worked without a hitch. Once the system was drained, and all of the goblins on the outside had gotten smart and fled, as they should, the dwarves would then clean out what remained in the basements, and collected any gear that was worth salvaging. Everything else was ejected into the lava sea down the very long tube that the dwarves dug earlier in the fortress, some years ago at this point. And as the dwarves were finishing up this round of cleanup, they heard some rumblings in the depths. Quick! Grab your weapons. The beasts lurk. And oh, they did have to grab their weapons, for the forgotten beast, aptly named Oh No, has come. A great osprey with external ribs. It has 2 long, curly tails, and it is slavering. Its rose feathers are fluffed out. Beware, its webs. For those of you uninitiated, webs are one of the most dangerous things a forgotten beast can have. Essentially, spider webs, shot out by a creature that probably shouldn't have spider webs, which often leads to some pretty grotesque mental images. What makes webs so deadly is it's a guaranteed stun. Any dwarf that encounters them is forced to lie down, cannot dodge, and is forced to sit in this state, webbed, for a concerningly large amount of time. While a dwarf is webbed, they are incapable of fighting back, and the creature that isn't webbed has a 100% chance to hit them. And due to my expectations of it causing massive collateral damage, I got ahead of myself here and just pre-prepared some tombs, because we're probably going to need them. And as the creature moved its way towards my fortress, probably making some horrific bird noise, flapped its way over the wall and immediately started getting to work. The first dwarf unfortunate enough to be caught in its clutches was Reg, a weaponsmith and recent recruit to the military. They were simply unfortunate enough to be one of the first ones to arrive, and while they did have a crossbow and were able to fire a few bolts before the creature landed on them, it was over rather quickly, hopefully painless. The good news is, the Forgotten Beast did take some damage, because as you can see it's now labeled as injured, so that's good I guess. As it moves west, it begins to head towards its next victim, another Marksdwarf. Yutaro was the leader of my Marksdwarf squad. He had a rather large family, and several children, as well as an artifact crossbow which he made himself. Unfortunately, even though Yutaro was able to get several pristine shots out with his crossbow and draw some blood, once caught in the webs, the poor dwarf's life was no longer measured in months, days, or years, instead seconds. Still hungry for more, the creature flapped its way towards my lower door, but a sound echoed through the caves. And this was a sound that was cause for celebration. For something had collapsed deep down below, and it wasn't caused by the beast. This was the sound and the alarm set off by a gremlin being caught in my trap. But, as exciting and as good as this news is, we currently had bigger fish to fry. Or birds to fry, if you will, because the big oh no was still at large. So after confirming that the gremlin was indeed trainable, as shown by this little whistle button over on the right, Forgotten Beast took priority, and it was still heading towards my entrance. Of course I let it in because, well, we'd have to get to the gremlin somehow, and leaving it out there with a caged gremlin just seemed cruel to both the gremlin and the beast. And besides, it was already injured. Can't let the good crossbow shots go to waste. As it climbed up the stairwell, or flew up the stairwell, my dwarves came down to meet it. It immediately filled the space up with webs, and hopefully not all of the dwarves would get webbed simultaneously, or be able to block it with their shields. I'm sure they were whacking it repeatedly, in a very pro-wrestling fashion. And as the brave militia dwarves stack up on top of the creature, and it plucks them off one by one, eventually, the dwarves were lucky enough to get some hits in. The creature could no longer breathe. Now it was just a matter of time before it bled out, or suffocated. A great beast that survived so many decades fell that day in the stairwell of Cloud Thunder. Kavish was heralded as a hero for killing the beast, but it was far from the biggest victory, because the dwarves had captured a very intelligent and mysterious creature, a gremlin, and it needed to be trained. At least, after they chased away that cave crocodile. It must have smelled gremlin. They are rather fragile, after all. Once the funny-shaped dinosaur was chased away, the dwarves could get back to resetting the trap, and beginning the basic task of explaining to the gremlin that, if you stick around, we will give you more pieces of prepared horse brain. Clearly, it worked, because the gremlin immediately agreed to stay. And so its cage was constructed near the tavern, before being released into a burrow of his own. Now, I have something I need to admit here. At the beginning of this video, I mentioned that gremlins were very baked into Dwarf Fortress's code, and I feel like I should make good on that statement and elaborate a little bit. Simply put, gremlins have been in Dwarf Fortress for a very, very long time. In fact, they existed in Dwarf Fortress back when the game was only 2 dimensions. They would live in the chasm and had the ability to emerge from your well. Chasms were the game's original kind of equivalent of cavern layers. Their task was simple: emerge from the well, or appear in the chasm, and pull a lever, and then vacate the premises. The mischievous little green G's also had the ability to empty cages or release things from chains. In those days, gremlins were a pretty simple creature. But since then, Dwarf Fortress has gotten a lot more complicated. Tarn Adams has even stated that he's not sure how he would go about fixing them, as a lot of their baseline abilities are now depended on by other creatures. As an example, giant crabs can also pull levers, but that's a topic probably for a different video. In a way, gremlins themselves are almost a bug, because so many systems depend on their existence and the functions they provide, and in and of themselves can't really be changed. But because of those functions, they can cause some pretty broken behavior in the game, considering they are an intelligent creature that can be quote-unquote tamed, because they gained the tag exotic pet once the game became 3D. And while they cause problems, they also cause a lot of mischief and fun, making their very existence fascinating in the card castle of Dwarf Fortress's pile of systems, but maintained their ability to trigger pressure plates, pull levers, and empty cages. In fact, there's several notable stories of fortresses being destroyed because of gremlins pulling levers. However, these effects are disabled once they've been trained. And as Dwarf Fortress evolved into the modern state that it's in now, the exotic pet tag makes things very strange. As an example, once trained, like Gremmy is here, they appear as a stray pet, but it's very unlikely a dwarf will actually adopt them. They appear as a pet in the pet screen, as trained, but can be butchered, even though they're intelligent, which goes against dwarven ethics. They also have the ability to do some tasks around the fortress, because they're considered an intelligent creature. But not all tasks, because they're still considered a pet. Essentially, I can't make them clothing. and that's going to be something we're going to have to deal with. But because they can talk and are intelligent, they will discuss with dwarves, learn skills, and take part in guilds. Once they get good enough at speaking, it's theoretically possible, if not likely, that they'll be eventually elected mayor, because all they do is walk around and talk.
I was confined. It was so boring.
Wait, where'd that voice come from? Huh, strange. Well anyways, the dwarves elect the dwarf or creature that has the highest speech skills. Now that we have a gremlin in the fortress, and the fortress has clearly fallen on some tough times, I'm currently under the assumption that the gremlin is doing its best to converse with everybody in the fortress, making friends, and learning the necessary skills to perhaps take over. And of course, cause as much chaos as possible.
I'll join you. Let me be free.
Like seriously, is there a fly in my office or something? But if a gremlin is a mischievous schemer, then a dwarf is a crazy teenager with incredible amounts of ADHD, because they had other things on their minds, such as invading the enemy and trying to steal their stuff, but mostly getting kidnapped, fighting with that ugly unicorn that keeps on practicing its hole punch cosplay on my dwarves' chests. Best we stab him repeatedly with our pointy sticks, or whack him repeatedly with our heavy shields, no matter the cost. And believe it or not, that angry unicorn is quite threatening, so I always had to rebuild the military. And it's almost like the world didn't want us to continue existing here because we're also getting attacked by were-koalas, which is always a slow finessing task of trying to kill it without it biting you, because you don't want that infection to spread. Thankfully, that time was successful, unlike the previous infestation, which was a bit of a humpy ordeal. And never mind the constant sieges, those never really stopped, even if most of them were made up of thieves. No matter how threatening the enemy, the dwarves always managed to figure out some way to end up in the river, and of course that heavy armor made swimming very difficult. Some of them made it, but many dwarves would fall, thus refill the military. And I was beginning to realize that between the forgotten beasts, the sieges, and the deaths caused by both may have caused this fort to bite off more than it could chew, with the exception of a few very skilled dwarves. Everybody else was just kind of at a constant threat of death, but the show must go on, and our gremlin is learning to feel humiliated about their lack of clothing.
Will I ever get pants?
Thankfully, they liked being near a waterfall, and thankfully they do have one positive reoccurring memory about them getting released from that cage. If you want to know more about moods and emotions in Dwarf Fortress and reoccurring memories, I have a video basically covering that entire subject. It's a similar format to this one. It's called I Followed One Dwarf for 10 Years. It's about a dwarf called Cog. I do give it a good old recommendation here. I'll leave a link somewhere in the description. But all in all, our gremlin was doing quite well, aside from the need to cause trouble and have excitement. Maybe we'll be able to solve that someday. In the business, we call that foreshadowing. Oh no, people are dying again. Must have been the giant gazelles, or the giant thrips. No matter, we'll have more dwarves where that came from, and more sieges need to be sieging. And when we're not sieging, we're getting attacked by very slow enemies, such as these giant tortoises. And if not the tortoises, then definitely these very tall goats. It's like somebody stretched them. Strange creatures they are. But all the dwarves fear the most methodical of foes, with their smooth, silky skin. The giant snails. Mayor Tomatoes quiver in fear. Thankfully, the dwarves can just, puncture it and it dies immediately. While those may almost be entertainment for the dwarves, some darker tasks had to be done, such as dealing with the were-camel issue. There was no curing them, and the dwarves were not willing to care for them any longer, and were going to need the space in the hospital. Several years back, a dwarf got bit after getting punted into the creek. Several others also got bit as well. It was a sad tale. It's a shame it needed to end that way. But no matter how dark the tales become, some dwarves just continue to impress. This is Jasper, the leader of my military, completely naked, with the exception of a pair of shoes, beating, strangling, and punching to death an elven ambush. These elves were very oddly under-equipped. Most of them were identified as bards, and came wielding merely books. It's like they're trying to attack me with knowledge. It's never gonna work, though. We're far too dumb to read, just like my mayor, who's too dumb to know that they are outmatched by the gremlin who is coming for their job, because more forgotten beasts wait off in the wings. Grosmer has come, a towering quadruped composed of coke. It has 3 long, straight tails, and it undulates rhythmically. Beware its poisonous sting. Horrifying. As a matter of course, I sent just about the entire military down to take care of the creature, and while they were making their way down to the lower caverns to fight the thing, something horrible happened. The dreaded alert of death elsewhere in the fortress. Initially, I presumed it must just be the forgotten beast. However, the truth was much worse than that. It was a giant cave spider in the deepest cavern. And as I said earlier, with webs, they're a free stun. Except giant cave spiders also have a paralyzing, suffocating venom. When a dwarf is caught in their webs, it's a free hit, and you're guaranteed to die. Many dwarves fell that day, and before the militia could fend off the Forgotten Beast and then relocate to the higher levels, the creature made off with many dwarves' lives, military and otherwise, and skulked off into the darkness. Our gremlin was very unimpressed with the management here, and knew that their troublemaking could benefit the dwarves,
Yes, more power.
and was continuing to practice their speech skills. The gremlin had already gotten quite far, having become a hunter by hanging out and learning and speaking with dwarves in the Hunters Guild. The meeting with the mayor was definitely going to be an important one, and likely has absolutely nothing to do with this massive rattly danger noodle. It is cute though. Maybe it can be friends with my King Cobra. Against their better judgment, more dwarves kept arriving, and in the mix, alongside of a performance troupe, so did a Gorlak. We named him Tony. Welcome to the fortress, you yellow meatball. And Greeny McTall Ears here, it seems to also be relatively alright with things. He seems to like it here.
These dwarves are so easy to manipulate.
However, is dwelling upon being uncovered. He really would like a pair of clothing of some sort.
I need some pants.
Man, there's that voice again. What is that? And mulling over the reoccurring memory has changed his personal tendencies. Specifically, he became more bashful and learned to value decorum.
Like, shorts will do?
But of course, the wars raged on. Some fights ended better than others. The gremlin was encouraged to read up on the local histories, or rather, hide in the library while the Forgotten Beasts constantly attack. Anna here was a particularly brutal one, especially with that stinger. Zasset here was very unlucky and got caught out by the creature, and after a few near misses, eventually got, as all dwarves do. Rest in peace, Zasset. When the militia came into contact with the creature, it was initially a bit of a stalemate. Several dwarves became exhausted in the fighting, going berserk, getting stunned and tired, moving into states of overexertion. The rest of the military took too long to regroup, to find a bloody mess where there once was 2 dwarves. The first few rounds of reinforcements fell as quickly as the first. Civilians were also caught in the massacre too, and as our gremlin pondered the mysteries of the fortress, the Forgotten Beast rampaged up the stairwell, clashing through squad after squad, dwarf after dwarf, until finally, a lucky hit caused the creature to fly to pieces of lapis lazuli. But it's okay, the gremlin didn't mind. He was exhilarated after remembering getting into an argument and is having a drink and telling some poetry. But during this poetic intermission, a vile force of darkness has arrived. Which does, of course, mean that the goblins are attacking. However, things are about to get much worse for both me and the goblins. Because just moments later, a horn sounds. An ambush. Curse all friends of nature. Because at that exact moment, the elves have brought a zoo to invade us with. While their weapons are made of wood, their animals are quite large. Fortunately, they all need oxygen to not die, and I have lots of pointy swords. But unfortunately for me, some of these dwarves are a bit too ambitious, and decided to charge straight into the fighting. Well, unfortunately for them, we have to load up the gurgle tank. Some of my dwarves were a little bit overly ambitious, and as the mayor is given the order to pull the lever to glock the gurgle tank, they just barely managed to get back outside of it. This would force the elves back from the gates. The plan was simple. The elves were supposed to leave, and then go fight with the goblins directly. But it looks like they need a little bit of encouragement, so let's give them a bit of a push. Some years back, the dwarves also dammed the top of the waterfall in the north half of the map. And with a simple lever pull, we could also fill the creeks back up. This would cause some of those lizards to go involuntarily swimming even more so. However, I also had a momentary moment of stupidity, not realizing that that same lever was also connected partially to my front door. So I kind of flooded the front half of the fortress. It's fine. Nothing a little drainage won't fix. Now that most of the water is out of the way, and the elves have been given some enthusiasm, we can open the gates once more. And I made the decision to send the dwarves out to do battle with the elves that were still just out front. The goblins were still a ways off, and I wanted the dwarves to get on with it. Due to the fact that they were mounted on giant animals, which spook rather easily, the elves' siege scattered quicker than I had initially anticipated. And all of the fighting together caused the goblins to rout before they even made it to the gates. Well done, dwarves. I'm sure the gremlin will write some poetry about this, because he's going to be locked in that library for quite some time. Because only moments later, another forgotten beast has arrived. This one's named Oson, a scaly cockroach. Not only does this beast have noxious secretions, but it probably also has tickets to the final Suicidal Tendencies tour. After quickly crushing the first dwarf it encountered, the military quickly squished it. But the wars must go on, and our gremlin's mood continues to decline due to that lack of clothing. He doesn't even feel satisfied after yelling at somebody in charge anymore. At least he was excited remembering performing. Perhaps we should make him into a bard. He really wants clothes. If only we could make him some.
like shorts will do.
Seriously, do I need to get an alarm system for this place? Like, where is that voice coming from? Is it the neighbors?
Huh?
Just a little bit of an explanation here about the clothing thing. Different sizes of creatures in Dwarf Fortress need different sizes of clothing. As an example, human, elves, and goblins can all wear the same size of clothes, whereas humans need larger clothing. Gremlins are significantly smaller than a dwarf. They are less than a sixth of the size. Because of this, they can't even wear the smallest possible option for clothing, which is kobold clothing, because a kobold is about twice the size of a gremlin. Now, this is a problem because gremlins are intelligent creatures. Remember how earlier I was saying they're kind of just a bug in the game? Because they're intelligent, they have the same needs as any other intelligent creature, but the game doesn't have the capacity to actually satisfy those needs. So we're gonna have to overcompensate for that stress by making this gremlin as happy as possible. But that's going to be a whole lot of work.
Wait, why are you handing me a microphone? Are you trying to... What? People hold microphones? Why would they do it? I have a perfectly good microphone stand right here. All right, well, let's do it. Hello. I don't have the money for an exterminator, but I need to get these voices out of my head somehow.
Huh?
This is a crowdfunded channel. I don't do any sponsorships. And last time I checked, memory defragmenting is very expensive. To be able to afford this, I need some help. That's a mug. It's for sale in my merch store. You can see it right here. In order for me to be able to afford this kind of insanity, I need your help. So if you want, you can purchase this mug on my merch store. This video that I've been working on doesn't have any sponsorships in it. It's just me. I pay for all of this myself by selling these mugs. Also Twitch subscriptions and YouTube memberships, but mainly these mugs. I also have this one, which has a brain gremlin in its natural habitat demolishing a Windows 95 PC. If you purchase this one, you can use the code Gremlin, which I will just leave up indefinitely, which will get you a discount. Links are in the description, and
I need some pants.
After the carnage of the recent battles, giant vultures could be seen circling the fortress. Terrifying. Those aren't the talons you want to end up in any situation. So the dwarves decided to lock the doors, and I decided to see what I could do to cheer up this gremlin. He wants to acquire objects, eat a good meal, be extravagant, and wander. I kind of hoped that being captain of the guard would help satisfy some of these needs, which would allow him to wander by beating up my dwarves, and also be extravagant because I could appoint items to him. So I set him up as the captain of the guard. After immediately becoming frustrated at the scarcity of cages and chains, he goes to beat a criminal. And after beating said criminal, he became vengeful after joining an existing conflict. And then disillusioned after punishing somebody with a beating. Well, I guess he doesn't value the law enough for this to be a good line of work for you, Gremmy. We'll have to find something else. So the second choice here is the chief medical dwarf. This would allow him to tend to people's wounds, participate in diagnostics, and also have items assigned. The good news is, he still likes being drunk. The bad news is, he's getting tired of our alcohol variety. You picky bastard. Can't you tell that we're busy here? We're gonna need a quicker trap to clean, because frankly, this one is just getting a bit cumbersome. With the amount of bodies in it, if only we had a better option. We'll have to think of something. Some time has passed, and we're getting attacked by the goblins once more, but the squads are making quick use of them. This was right after they were returning from a raid, and the goblins just happened to raid us at the same time as they returned. Welcome back, dwarves. In the time that we were away, our gremlin has taken a name, Rem Relucium. While this isn't something that would normally happen unless the gremlin got adopted as a pet, I used a DF hack command, make own, to speed up the process. Simply select a creature that isn't part of your faction, and make own forces them to become a notable figure in history, and will make them join your fortress, thus giving them a name. Welcome, Rem, a true gremlin. We were able to give old Grammy an office, as part of being a chief medical dwarf. I've also managed to work on our food variety a little bit, and he seems to like the crundle intestines he's consuming. So that's good at least, but it's not stopping him from attending meetings and yelling at my manager and mayor relatively frequently. He's quite the complainer, this gremlin, quite the complainer.
I need some pants.
It's also quite amazing watching his little skills pop up. I've also noticed that I can add him to the military, so we've been training him occasionally. If you're wondering about the vengeful notices here, it's because there's a lot of agitated buzzards on the surface. They haven't really left. And when they get too close to the ceiling, the dwarves notice them, and they feel a sense of vengeance. This would happen with any kind of agitated creature, or any invader on the surface, such as goblins. But overall, I think the fortress is going quite well. Moods could be better, and the dwarves could be happier, but the militia is strong, the artifacts are plentiful, And once again, we still need a better way of disposing of enemy bodies before having to actually put them away ourselves. This is the main cause of the rough moods. It should be pretty self-explanatory. I mean, come on. Every time I do open the door, we get assaulted by giant monkeys. And whenever we blink and get a break, another forgotten beast arrives. This one has poison vapors, and also managed to get into my upper tunnel, which isn't exactly what I would describe as ideal. Thankfully, my tame grizzly bears were able to soften it up quite a bit, and Jasper was able to kill it. She didn't even make it look like a challenge. And as the time passes, I've been working on a new project. As I said, I need a better method of getting rid of the enemies before they get into my fortress, as well as something that's a little bit more self-cleaning. So I've been working on a pump stack for another vile force of darkness. Whatever, we'll leave them outside for right now. Because Ustuth has just created a gold warhammer. We'll have to put that one to good use. I mean, look at this thing. Glorious. We'll get it assigned to my military right away. So where was I? Oh yeah, pump stack. I'm working on a very large pump stack that's going to pump lava down from the magma sea up and into my reservoir, thus replacing the water with lava, which is going to make things a little spicy, but will also significantly lower the amount of cleanup. This is the pattern that I use for making pump stacks. With the alternating openings, it allows for power to transport vertically, as well as allows liquid to flow through it. We just have to make sure that all of the materials used in the pump stack are lava safe, and do our best to keep our gremlin from going crazy in the meantime. At least he's content with his very good bedroom. The one truly good piece of news is we were able to assign some artifacts to our little chief medical, Gremlin. So he now walks around with an earring and a crown.
This place is great.
Okay, that's it. I'm calling an exterminator.
So about that cleanup. When it's completed, it's going to have two functions. I'm going to make some lava geysers, which is essentially pressurized lava that is higher than ground level, so that when you open up the floodgates, it allows kind of a geyser to appear. The second part is we're going to replace the water in my drowning trap with lava to just simply burn things from the get-go. Because as you can see, the pile of bodies is a bit of a problem, and the hospital is kind of too full. These are caused by the recent tantrums that have been happening, thanks to the moods consistently degrading. And also, annoying problems like this guy, whose poison gas caused spontaneous bleeding. That's mostly dwarf blood. Thankfully, not too many of them died in the process. And as the year passed, projects started to look somewhat complete, and the fortress was starting to look quite nice again, after those times of crisis. And one fateful autumn, the mayor met with the outpost liaison, and they asked a simple question. Who would we like to appoint to be Baron of Cloud Thunder? The dwarves were excited with the good news, and appointed their good friend, Rem, who at that moment attained the rank of the Stray Baron of Cloud Thunder. Because his technological achievements, well, the dwarves' technological achievements, were about to erupt in fire. The orders were given as our gremlin settles into his new job and likely begins to issue orders. The reservoir began to fill, and of course the system had to be tested. Floodgates were opened, and it worked flawlessly, with one small problem. See, the fortress is situated in an area that is full of grass and trees, and putting lava up there is gonna cause some pretty big fires, which it did. Now, this wouldn't normally be a problem, aside from the fact that sometimes trees can collapse in these fires. And while I was preparing to lock the dwarves inside so that the fire could burn itself out, one of those trees collapsed, and that collapse drained my entire water reservoir and filled most of my fortress's kitchen. Now, this would be fine aside from the fact that most of my dwarves can't swim, which will immediately drown dwarves. This calamity didn't last as long as it could have. We were able to solve it relatively quickly by simply telling the dwarves to get the hell out of there, and then watching as many helpless dwarves drowned. Many helpless dwarves drowned, and eventually the dwarves listened and did in fact get out of there. Eventually this would fill most of the fortress up, so to solve a problem really quickly, the dwarves decided to empty the remainders of the reservoirs, which unfortunately took this guy along for a fun water slide. And while not many dwarves died, one child unfortunately fell directly down into the drain chute, which was maybe one of the most brutal deaths I've ever seen in Dwarf Fortress. Goodbye, child. I already miss you. Now, most of the water had been drained out at this point, so I decided to get a little bit intense. We rerouted the lava flow and burned a lot of our trash at the bottom of the drain, and then also redirected it into our main trash so that we just didn't have to worry about that either, which of course was then just drained down into the caverns. And while the fire outside did do a decent job cleaning up the mess that we'd left, we wanted to finish the job. So I expelled a bunch of lava onto the surface through my recently constructed secondary lava geyser. Which hopefully wouldn't cause the same problem to happen twice because, well, we fixed it, mostly. Somebody also thought it would be a good idea to arrive as a migrant right now, which I personally think is the worst thing you could possibly do. But hey, more power to them. I think they all made it into the fortress. Renovations had to take place in the entryway. New bridges would need to be installed. Our new Baron's quarters needed to be appointed, and the Gremlin was, still needy, as he's always been, and is now making stranger requests.
These dwarves are so easy to manipulate. Dig, dig, dig!
Oh, shut up, you! More goblins have arrived, but thankfully that's no longer an issue for us. For whenever goblins arrive, we simply give the order to pull a lever.
Yes!
And, burninate them, as a wise man once said. But those dwarves would never get a break, frankly, because whenever the sieges were done, more werecamels would show up. And no matter how skilled your soldiers are, someone's inevitably going to get bit. It's a shame. You were a very excellent, skilled dwarf. I guess we'll just lock you in a room in the hospital forever now. Maybe drown you eventually. The Gremlin's Baron's quarters were coming along quite nicely. By the time we completed them, right next to the little graveyard, they'll likely be a duke, so we'll just skip a few steps and make them lavish and practically for royalty. And as the years passed, many things in Cloud Thunder stayed the same. The forgotten beasts continued to arrive, the dwarves continued to die valiantly, and tunnels were continuously dug for lava. But not every siege died to the flames. Some of them were still dealt with by hand. This final siege held great losses, and many good dwarves died that day, including all of the spearmasters. It was a miscommunication between leadership and the dwarves. Thankfully, the dwarves had finished installing the lava reservoirs. And those goblins didn't have a chance. And the dwarves decided perhaps it was time to listen to their leader's orders and begin to dig further. Because with all these wars, in order to maintain superiority, the dwarves needed weapons, and all the rumors did say that deep down below, that were tougher than iron and sharper than steel. It just might be worth the risk. The dwarves were hunting for the legendary adamantine, a pale blue metal said to be sharper than any other material. But many threats lay in their way, for they had to traverse through the lowermost cavern layer, one that had been largely abandoned for the last 10 years, and it was full of, well, you guessed it, more forgotten beasts, which swiftly did what forgotten beasts do, killing the first few miners to enter the basement. Thankfully, there were soldiers stationed and ready. They did fight the crazy noodle with wings, but as always, the creature finally fell. After losing its wings, the dwarves then cleansed the caverns to the best of their abilities, using the only methods they knew, burning it. A task that they were quite well practiced in at this point. However, they made a small miscalculation, and the lava began to overflow onto the plateau, above the vein of the very, very valuable material, and it caught their support structure alight. This caused a portion of their support structure to come crashing down, and expose what lay below: water, treasures beyond their imagination, and a horrific shriek from an unknowable terror deep below, emerging from the newly exposed pocket. This creature was a snow demon, fragile and brittle. It was obliterated by the flying bricks. It murmurs horrible curses, and died as soon as it emerged. Next to it was a dead soldier maceman, a great creature created by the gods of old. It was composed of ash and had a round shell. It was tall, and it was wielding twisted metal mace, a twisted metal shield, and twisting metal gauntlets. Must have been a fan of PlayStation, and he also died on impact. The one survivor was the Midnight Blue Devil, which was a large Gila monster twisted into humanoid form. It had lidless eyes and a bloated body. Its midnight blue scales were small and close set. Beware its poison bite. While it had sustained horrendous injuries, it was crawling through the lava flows, seemingly unamused by them, before turning around and making its way to the entrance of the fortress. The monster made its way towards the central stairwell before colliding with the dwarves. Many dwarves fell before the creature met its match. And shortly after the fated moment where a wrestler struck the devil, in the left foot with its steel shield. Bruising the muscle, the creature fell in pain, screaming about its foot, most likely. What bested the creature was a wrestler who bit the Midnight Blue Devil in the lower leg, which bruised the fat, after striking it in the upper body with their hammer, which bruised their lung. The creature suffocated in that stairwell, and the monster was no more, slain by Abel, the Hammer Dwarf. But now wasn't time for celebrations, for greater threats lay ahead. And the dwarves were learning that there was blessings in the crazy numbers of monsters they had found in these basements. As instructed by their now leader, Duke Rem of Cloud Thunder, they must entrap some of these beasts and use it as part of their defense strategy. But Rem had seen better days. He'd been appointed to Duke of multiple fortresses now, Cloud Thunder and Inkwon. Rem was still humiliated about the lack of clothing and falling into a deep depression and stress.
Will I ever get pants?
Perhaps his ideas weren't as gifted as they once were, but this one maybe was an alright idea. The dwarves had captured several forgotten beasts in their time, and the idea with this setup is that the two forgotten beasts that shot webs would both be locked behind these doors, and then sealed inside. When foul beasts emerged from the depths, they would be caught in these webs, and perhaps even trapped in cage traps, or this would alternatively make the process of slaying them easier, as the dwarves would have a cleaner shot to clean them up. But only time will tell, because the dwarves were still getting attacked by yet another siege. Honestly, at this point, it was starting to seem like the dwarves would just charge into them, hoping for the sweet release of death. Because most sieges were accompanied by elven ambushes, and we would have to fight both inevitably. Several of my dwarves ran into the tunnel to be with that goblin invasion, and were thus burned with the lot of them, or at the very least, their bodies were torched. The biggest mistake the dwarves made during that siege was only watching the siege, because apparently they'd missed a forgotten beast from the lowest levels, and it had just made its way into the mining tunnels. Dream Auras the Poisoned was a terrifying beast, slaughtering its way through countless dwarves. The hallways were blighted with viscera and filled with gore, until a brave farmer picked up a knife that had been left by some former visitor and ran past the creature, slicing its throat. The dwarf who did this deed was unknown to the rest of the dwarves, because they were a royal guard of the queen, who had only just arrived. Fully suited in her armor, completed with her crown, she was here to serve the mighty Gremlin, or so the Gremlin presumed. The dwarves were overjoyed at the arrival of their queen, and quickly prepared a place for her to stay. The dwarves hoped that this would mean a new golden age for Cloud Thunder, a time of trade and prosperity, but fortresses such as these are not to be given a wealthy fate. Instead, they must work and toil in the depths, and continue to dig deeper.
Dig, 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 dig deeper.
Old Dookie Gremmy needed to have a meeting with the queen. He wanted a spear and private training. He was so indignant about the queen that he didn't even feel anything, and hoped that the dwarves would continue listening to his rules and orders, because maybe one day soon he would rule. Or so he hoped. The dwarves were successfully putting together the gremlins' plans, however, and the two forgotten beasts had been stationed, both of them equipped with their webs and ready to spray. But first, the dwarves had to get to work cleaning up the mess left behind by the goblins. Goblins that they still had to deal with. When will they ever learn? Never, most likely. Thankfully, some progress can just be made, and the concussive digging practices of the dwarves continued, and something else evil is emerging from the newly exposed pockets. A chaotic enforcer. This creature was not killed by the falling bricks. Beware its poisonous sting. Moving up through the cave levels, eventually it encountered the military, and Mistum, who was no green dwarf, was ready to fight the Clear Devil, and with a great display of skill, bested the creature. And the Lord Gremlin needed another meeting. This time he was demanding the spear. So the dwarves obliged, hoping that it would help improve his mood. Because no matter how grumpy or stressed he was still in charge of the fortress. And as the next siege approached, Gremmy was having one of his moments, and wandering around aimlessly in depression, utterly unaware of his surroundings. Encountered the siegers, and took part in the battle. I'm sure he would say that he got hits in, but the reality was very different. He mostly jumped away, and shouted about how there is no hope. As the battle ended, Gremmy was carried to hospital with the rest of the dwarves, as the remains of the siege were burned. Eventually, Gremmy would recover, more bandaged than Gremlin, and wandered back to his throne room as monkeys attacked the forges. And the Gremlin gave the orders to continue digging, and so the dwarves obliged and gave the lever a fateful tug. The crash was louder than normal. The dwarves had discovered an eerie cavern. The air above the dark stone floor was alive with vortices of purple light and dark, boiling clouds. Seemingly bottomless, glowing pits marked the surface. The dwarves had discovered the underworld, as well as the faded adamantine. Praise the miners. But the horrifying screams from the darkness was like nothing the dwarves had ever seen or heard before. The reality was, the dwarves got extremely lucky. That cave-in, while it had exposed the great tunnels to the underworld, it had also caused a water leak and a drip of lava to be spilled, which sealed the hole seconds after it was created. So while they had discovered the underworld, they'd also saved themselves from it. They could safely mine all of the adamantine from around the tunnels and fully equip and train their soldiers. Gremmy gave the orders and then proceeded to watch a furnace operation. He wanted to know exactly how the smelting process of adamantine worked. Gremmy had a small dagger strapped to his upper body. This was made from godlike material, which was found caked inside of an obsidian wall, and he would use it to carve depictions of his frustrations, mostly due to the lack of clothing, for he was often inflamed with hatred, and easily developed hatred towards things. He would often flee even the most necessary battle to avoid any form of physical confrontation. He's cripplingly shy, and deliberately cruel to those unfortunate enough to be subject to his sadism. He would feel the strongest urges and seek the quickest rewards, and found a chaotic mess preferable to the boredom of harmonious living. He was sloppy with his living space, very stubborn, and rarely happy or enthusiastic. Found obligations confining, was never discouraged, and curious, and eager to learn. Doesn't seek out excitement, and has an active sense of humor.
Could I have a skirt? Like shorts will do?
Shut up, you! And doesn't really care about anything anymore. He remembered the trap, where he came from, and how the dwarves imprisoned him, but gave him an opportunity to dwell and live with them. He remembered the bravery of the dwarves, the sieges, and the battles. He remembered the time that he spent with the dwarves, and the places that they'd built for him. He admired their courage and conviction for continuing to fight back against the goblin hordes. He praised them for their ingenuity and their creativity, and cursed their obsession with trade and commerce, and wished that those goblins would just leave them alone. But perhaps they would, if they were all dead. So that was the goal of our dear Gremlin, to take this fortress over as a place for himself. He could finally have some peace and quiet, and it wouldn't matter if he was unclothed. And it was at this moment our Duke became slightly feral, and moved to his office to speak with one of his associates of how this plan could be accomplished. The dwarves set up traps next to the web-spraying beasts, and began to dig once again.
Dig, dig, dig deeper.
But an Ember's specter emerged from the depths, taking the name Savage Controls after killing the dwarf whom discovered it, and it moved towards the stairwell. Waiting to greet it was Zon, stationed on that stairwell. An Ember's demon is a great towering humanoid composed of flame. The dwarf began to duel with the creature, spilling its viscous ichor, ripping it limb from limb, and tearing it to shreds, until a fateful moment where the Ember's specter kicked the dwarf in the right hand, which bruised the muscle through their gauntlet, causing her to tumble down into the mines. The Ember's specter made pace, following her, hoping to finish the job, colliding with Ast, known locally as Big Duck, who dueled with the specter. Big Duck fell moments after he laid eyes on the creature, and the specter began to rampage through the depths. Dwarf after dwarf began to fall, including the first one he fought with, until Stinthad punched it. "Begone, fear," she screamed, and the creature fell, exploding into small bits of ash. And under the gremlin's orders, the dwarves began to chisel a staircase down into hell. Most of the soldiers had at least one weapon made of adamantine at this point. They hoped that would be enough. Discovering the entrance of the underworld is one thing, but attempting to construct into it is something entirely different.
Immediately, the demonic hordes noticed the dwarves' ploy and challenged it. And off, in the caves, a familiar echo. Something had emptied an elk bird out of a cage trap. Only one creature was capable of such a feat, and it wasn't our gremlin. There were others out there, and Gremmy knew that.
No, we must keep digging.
The dwarves fought as bravely as they could at the entrance of hell, fending back the beasts, but there was only so much they could really do. The creatures flew directly into the fortress, and it didn't take long for them to find the lowest tavern. The bloodshed had begun. Death at this point was mostly inevitable. The dwarves did what they could and prepared themselves. And our Duke Gremlin simply sat, smiled, and waited. And to his credit, his plan wasn't all bad, although it seems the deadly dust had a bit of an advantage over the webs, but some of them were actually tumbled into some of the cage traps, which is quite a miracle, if you ask me. In a way, this design is exactly what we used to catch the gremlin at the beginning. If something is lying down, it's forced into a cage trap. This includes if it's knocked backwards or caught in a web. A nifty bit of engineering, if nothing else. But do keep in mind, if the creature's made of fire and the cage is made of wood, it will burn its way out. The dwarves waited with bated breath, and it wouldn't take long before they started to smell the dust. Dense clouds wafted under the doors. And while many creatures were stuck in the eternal vortex down below, the first had begun to enter the fortress. Before the dwarves even saw it enter the room, the fight was on. Dust, viscera, and vomit. Grave Crypt, the fatal urn, had entered the fortress, having already killed 25 of their friends. The creature moved through the central fortress as if it was nothing, pushing its way through dwarves as if they were made of paper. It's hard to say what a dwarf would feel in a situation like this. The fatal urn was quite the threat. Few dwarves who saw it would ever live to tell the tale. It was just that ungodly. Eventually, it moved into the upper levels. And while the Mark's dwarves fired bolts, the creature was moving towards the side door, trying to make an escape. And it didn't really matter how many dwarves tried to fight it, for they couldn't really get close enough. It would simply blast them away with its dust. At this point, it was down to luck. Something needed to hit it, or nothing would ever touch it. And Grave Urns, the Fatal Crypt, built up the highest body count of any creature in the fortress, and continued to roam this place. But the dwarves had an opportunity to show those devils who truly was in charge. The Fatal Crypt would likely see the end of all of these dwarves, but they could see the end of their own fortress. Under their terms. They would expel lava and flood the fortress. They had the power, at least until something would destroy it. The beasts wouldn't likely be susceptible to such threats, but at the very least the dwarves could have the last laugh, or the last barbecue, if you will. And alongside of grave crypts, another creature emerged with a great name, Death Ash, the Burial of Phantoms, stalking its way through Fortress Cloud Thunder. And as the lava slowly entered the fortress became silent. A few dwarves who were left in the hospital wished they got out while they still could. Onul, the clother, was crushed under the weight of 1,000 years. And Rem, sitting alone in his new fortress, thought to himself,
Finally, my chance!
He'd achieved many things, and became quite the character. Was embarrassed sleeping in a very poor bedroom and remembered that for years, until finally gaining one that he was truly respected for. Never did quite get over the embarrassment of the lack of clothing, but he was happy, having earned a fortress of his own, as the final few dwarves fell. But since the gremlin was the last thing alive, he realized he had a problem. The door was locked. How was he going to get out? Well, no matter. He would simply unlock the door and do what he's always done. Sneak past the threat and make his way out as he always would. Naturally, he's a gremlin. He can't die. What kind of thought is that?
That's it! I've won!
He did what he thought was best and unlocked the door.
Look what you made me do. Oh God, what have I done? Oh God, what have I...
And that brings us to the end of Cloud Thunder. First off, I would like to extend a huge thank you to Von Galactic for offering me his voice for the Gremlin. If you haven't checked out his channel, he also makes videos that are kind of like these ones about Dwarf Fortress, and I think that they're great and you should go give them a watch. but we made it this far, so now's where I always say the thing. When you leave a comment on this video, which you should, because that's the only thing that makes the YouTube algorithm go burr, aside from likes and dislikes, of course, include the word Gremlin. Then I'll know that you made it to the end. I do hope you enjoyed this one, as much as I enjoyed making it. This video was constructed with 90 hours of footage. If you'd like to see all of that footage, it's in the playlist, which I'll leave in the description of this video, which can be found on my Blind Extras channel. So after you go subscribe to Von Galactic, please go subscribe to my VOD channel, or just check out the playlist of this fortress. I've honestly been kind of burnt out this week, and took this video as an opportunity to kind of reset mentally and physically, and get back to where I should be with videos and streaming. So thus, I'll be streaming this week, and next week, and the week after. I'm looking forward to it, and hope you are too. I'll see you live on twitch.tv/blindIRL, or this very YouTube channel. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you very soon.
Pum pum. Pum pum.